Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I presume you can all hear me. I talk about the way to empty a church is to make me sing or put me on after obviously a much more interesting speaker. I'm going to talk to you about single source in defence contracting, and in particular I'm going to talk about risk. I'm an ex-army officer and have worked both sides of the trench. So I've worked purchasing equipment and I've worked for what used to be Vickers Defence Systems on the Challenger 2 main battle tank programme. But risk is an interesting challenge, particularly in the defence world, because as contractors and contracting authorities, people worry about financial risk and the risk of equipment. I would argue, having been a soldier on the front line, if you don't get it right, I get killed. That kind of puts a new dimension on risk. And risk is a challenging subject. I mentioned the other day, if you'd put a fiver on Corbyn to be leader of the Labour Party, Leicester City to win the Premiership, the UK to Brexit, and heavens above, the new president of the US, I think you'd have probably got 50,000 to 1, no matter how you worked out the risk. But I work in a world where risk is really, really important. That's what I'm going to talk about today. I will gloss over the introduction bits and concentrate on the issue of risk for both the Ministry of Defence and indeed the contractors who provide the equipment, which is the day-to-day work of the soldier, sailor and airman. What are we? We're an independent regulator of the UK government. We are not civil servants. We're not employed by the Ministry of Defence. And we work inter alia through the Office of the Prime Minister. We have two principal aims. They're on the slide. It's good value for money for the taxpayer, but as importantly, we need a robust and confident defence industry. Therefore, they need to get a good return on their investment. That is a challenge because industry generally work on their profitability and their effectiveness on the return on capital employed. That is not always possible in the defence industry because the Ministry of Defence and HMG and the Treasury fund a great deal of the capital up front. So trying to work out return on capital employed is difficult. So we work on a thing called allowable costs, which I'll come on to in a moment. Can I just remind you that underpinning those two principles of value for money for the taxpayer and a fair return for the investor is most importantly operational capability at the front line. You will have seen the horror stories of soldiers dying due to lack of body armour and equipment being late. That is something that cannot happen. We are a tiny nation. The armed forces is smaller than the US Coast Guard. We're a tiny force, our buying power is low. So that operational capability underpins everything we do. So what's single source procurement? Single source procurement is where the Ministry of Defence do not enter into competition and decide either for reasons of national security and or national capability and or lack of competition that they wish to retain the market with a single contractor. It is a startling number, and it's nearly 50% of defence spending is single source. That is the largest in the Western world, with one exception, and that is France. And I'm half Belgian, so I've got to be very careful because I don't like the French. But of course, most French defence contractors are partly owned, if not wholly owned, by the government. Therefore, single sourcing to themselves is not truly single source. I've also not included Russia, China or North Korea. As you're aware, North Korea probably don't do a great deal of outsourcing. So, what's our background? There was a lot of criticism in the press about single source contracting, the MOD being inept, contractors making too much money, soldiers dying due to lack of body armour, etc., etc., etc. And of course, the Daily Mail loved this kind of thing and splashed it all over the papers. As a result, the government instructed and commissioned Lord Curry to carry out a root and branch review of single source procurement in the defence sector. It was not a very complimentary report. As a result of that, the Better Defence Acquisition White Paper was produced, which resulted in the Defence Reform Act 2014, which created the Single Source Regulations Office. We've been in place for 2 years now, and we are there to act as an interface in between the Ministry of Defence and defence contractors. A busy slide. If you could concentrate on the two circles. We have a number of aims, a number of functions to carry out our aim, which is that value for money and fair return for the taxpayer. Because it's not return on capital, it is allowable cost, the cost to produce a piece of equipment, multiplied by a baseline profit rate, which includes additions, which I'll come on to in a minute. And secondly, our aim is that every defence contract is visible. Single source contracting used to be done under the table. Nobody knew how much was being paid, what was being received. We are now the controller of that spend, and we see what's spent, how, when, where, and how. So what's the regime about? The regime is about all contracts over 5 million which are single source, i.e. with no competition. All of those subcontracts which are over 25 million, that might seem the wrong way around, it's not an error on the slide. The aim of the 25 million is to protect small and medium-sized enterprises from onerous reporting. What is interesting is all the qualifying subcontracts that have been entered into by major contractors have been with themselves, i.e. that's a major contractor subcontracting with another major contractor. So you would argue that the SME argument is a bit superfluous. Any agreement with a foreign government, the P-8 aircraft with the US, the C-17 aircraft with Boeing through the US, any contract that is procured through a foreign government is exempt the regulations. UK industry is not happy about that being exempt. They feel it's an unfair advantage for foreign nations who don't have to comply with our legislation. Any contracts for the acquisition of land and buildings and acquisition for security purposes, MI5, MI6, and the Special Forces is exempt the regulations. The Secretary of State does have the ability to exempt a contract. He does that for a number of reasons. One is software licensing, for example. Oracle are sponsoring today. If you try and buy a license from Oracle or SAP and try and impose a pricing structure on them, well, good luck, because it's a catalogue item and you have to pay what you have to pay. There's an interesting article that was in the press recently. The nuclear submarine, now called the Dreadnought class, which is successor, and the Astute class submarine are being built with French steel. As a Belgian, I'm not a great fan of that, but nevertheless, for some reason, according to the press, the government, indeed BAES, decided to buy French steel single source outside the regime. There is a question to be asked about, did they push hard enough to buy the steel from elsewhere? And the view was that the steel made in the UK was not of the correct style and standard. Had they dug a bit further down the supply chain, they would have found that not only Tata, or whatever they called this week, could make that steel, but it could also be pressed to the required density in this country. And that's the kind of thing we're looking at. It only applies to existing contracts. Any contract that is amended has to be agreed by both the contracting authority and the contractor, something that we're trying to change in a review of the legislation. One of our major roles is to recommend to the Secretary of State the baseline profit rate. So what happens? You take the allowable costs, £100 million, say, to build a piece of equipment. Those have to meet the allowable cost guidance, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. And there is a 6-step process to add a number of items or detract a number of items from that baseline profit rate. And you can see those in the chart on the right. I'm colourblind, so I can't tell you what colours are up there, but in those squares on the right. That's why I couldn't join the RAF or the Navy. Apparently, port and starboard has some rubbish to do with navigation. All costs must be allowable. We are a principles-based organisation and not a rules-based organisation. So we determine what costs should be allowable, not costs are allowable. And it's up to the Ministry of Defence and the contractors, indeed, to agree what those rates should be. They have to meet what we call appropriate, attributable, and reasonable in the circumstance to be allowable. Things that are allowable are things like rework, where you're first in class and you're building something for the first time and you have to do it again. Mandatory insurances are allowable costs, impairment of goodwill, risk and employee benefits. I'm going to come back to risk in a minute because that's a key area for us. Costs that are not allowable under the new regime, which were allowable under the old regime, are things like faulty workmanship, contingency funding. It was common in defence contracts, in contingency funding, for them to put a 10% contingency into the contract. That money was not spent and the contractor kept the contingency at the end of the contract. That's no longer allowable. Sales and marketing costs. Because all contracts under this regime are single source, you don't get sales and marketing to sell overseas. You've won this contract without any competition, so sales and marketing costs are not allowed. Entertainment, you might think that's a bit odd, but we have evidence of Christmas parties for the children and families of employees being made an allowable cost, on which a profit was also applied. And those are the kind of things that we're trying to trap and pull out of the regime. We also ensure that the customer only pays once. There's a thing called POCO, which is profit on cost once. And it is frequent for contractors, particularly in the defence world, to subcontract with one of their foreign subsidiaries, and the foreign subsidiary gets a profit on which the prime contractor gets a profit. So you're getting profit twice. And POCO, profit on cost once, ensures that that no longer happens. We collect analysis. It's the first time it's been done. We collect analysis on every single defence contract. And the aim of that I'll come to later. But it gives the MOD a repository of information to enable them to become a smarter buyer in the future. We have a single repository so we can see where every pound and dollar is spent, what it's spent for, how it's spent, and when it's spent. We produce a number of defence benchmarks and parametrics for the MOD and publish them. We produce an annual compliance report that illuminates whether the regime is working or not working. And we carry out what's called value for money studies for the Secretary of State. Oh, I'm going to doolally here. We publish a number of statistical bulletins which are available on our website. They're a riveting read if you're in the market. If you're not, they're not a riveting read. But they talk about the metrics that apply to the defence industry and look at a number of things you can see there: profit rates, contract duration, and the international aspect of qualifying defence contracts. We have a published report about public sector procurement and defence contracting. We are a post-contract organisation. There is a question to be asked whether the Ministry of Defence should be single sourcing the contracts that they single source. That is currently not in our remit. But there is an argument, for example, on the French steel, could that have been contracted in a different way rather than single source? The idea of our regime is to replicate competition, to put that competitive leverage into a contract, which is very difficult when you're dealing with a contractor who knows he's won the contract. If you want to buy a nuclear submarine in UK, there's no good putting an advert in the Oju or bunging it in the Telegraph, because there are not many manufacturers of nuclear submarines in the UK. And do we want to buy them from South Korea? Probably not. Do we want to buy them from the Americans? No. Do we want to buy them from the French? Definitely not. So you're kind of stuck with that single source. How do you create that leverage? And we've written a report to look at whether and how single source procurement is applied. This slide is our biggest challenge. The biggest opportunity for benefit for the taxpayer and the frontline commands is increased and enhanced operational capability. You do that by creating a risk element in the contract to make sure that the right thing is procured at the right price at the right time to the right specification. Stuff you will all know. What we've done is create a regime where if a cost and a risk is manageable by the contractor, that may be an allowable cost. And we talk about that risk being within the power of the contractor. It is absolutely up to them. They have been making nuclear submarines or aircraft aircraft carrier or destroyers or frigates or tanks for some time. They will have risk registers. They will know that element of risk. They will put it into a Monte Carlo analysis. They will work out its likelihood. That's allowable. There is program risk, and program risk is a big problem in defence contracting, and that happens in two cases. One, where the Ministry of Defence provide what we call government-funded equipment. That could be a radio system, a ballistic missile system, a command and control system, where the contractor is reliant on the Ministry of Defence to provide those products to the manufacturing process. The contractor takes the risk, but how do they know whether the MOD is going to be late or not? They cannot risk profile that. That risk is outside their control. For that, we give up to a 25% increase to the profit rate or a minus 25% decrease to the profit rate. That is not to the overall cost, it's to the baseline profit rate. It is difficult to measure and manage that risk. Left of ARC, you're looking at project risk, and we, as an independent arbiter, find it difficult to understand if that risk has been properly measured and managed. Because, of course, if you put more risk into the programme and that risk doesn't come to fruition, you have made additional cost on which you've got additional profit. If it's a programme risk, is it truly outside your control or is it not? Because the second area outside their control could be where the Ministry of Defence have insisted that something is outsourced to a third party. An example is the Astute-class submarine and the Dreadnought-class submarine, where the nuclear steam raising plant, in effect an engine made out of nuclear rods, that powers the submarine, is made by Rolls-Royce. The government have insisted that the manufacturer of the nuclear submarine buy the nuclear steam raising plant from a subcontractor. It is reliant on the subcontractor to create that nuclear steam raising plant to time, to specification, and get it to the manufacturing process at the right time. That is a risk the prime contractor has no control over. And funnily enough, a nuclear submarine doesn't go very fast without a nuclear steam raising plant. And they are complex pieces of kit to put together. They are not complicated. You will be told that nuclear submarines are complicated. They are not. They are a complex set of assembly items that are glued together. I have to say very carefully glued together because you don't want a nuclear submarine to leak. And that's our biggest issue of concern. How do we control that risk element? I was at SCAF yesterday, the Society of Cost Analysis Engineers, and it is very difficult. Risk is a complex area. It is an art, not a science. And we are sat in the middle of defence contractors who are trying to make as much money as they can. There's nothing wrong with that. And a defence community that want the submarine on time at any cost. And we have to sit in between those two. That gives us project and programme management challenges beyond belief. To build a nuclear submarine takes 124 months. That's a very long programme. And when you're building 4 of those, you're dealing with a contract for 35 years, where most of the people building it will be dead by the time the end of the programme comes. Very difficult to control that kind of project. What are the benefits of the single source regime? Not on there. There are a pair of eyes, indeed a number of pair of eyes, looking at both the defence community and the way they contract, and at the defence contracting community, and looking at the way they deliver to the Ministry of Defence. Those two are absolutely crucial. And the Ministry of Defence have declared significant efficiencies over the past year as a result of the regime. And you could argue that probably some of that is by us being in existence rather than us actually carrying out any proactive activity. We will in time create that huge database, which is of significant value to contractors. Knowledge is power. If you're buying a house or building an extension or building or relaying a garden, you've always got a metric. There's no metric. If I want to buy a new freezer, I would go online and check what the price of a freezer is. I can't go online and check what the price of a nuclear submarine is. Those are challenges, and we need those benchmarks. But benchmarks are dangerous because you can measure what's measurable and manage what's manageable, and neither are what you want. And it's very important you concentrate on outcomes and not outputs. And what is interesting is we measure gearboxes. Gearboxes are very expensive bits of kit, and we measure engines, which are also very expensive bits of kit. But if you just measure gearboxes and engines, you're going to end up with the wrong answer. Why? In an aircraft, an engine is really important. If it doesn't have an engine, it falls out of the sky. If it doesn't have a gearbox, it does not fall out of the sky, and it can land in a bit of a mess, and you wouldn't be on it drinking a Coke, but you will land. If you look at a helicopter, an engine is not important, but a gearbox is. Why is that? If you lose your engine when you're flying and your gearbox is working, you can auto-rotate and the helicopter will land. It will land quicker than you would like, but you'll get out. If you lose a gearbox in a helicopter and you've still got an engine, you are going to die because you will hit the ground at a rate of knots. There's no gearbox, no propeller, no flight. A gearbox on a helicopter is extortionate in comparison to a gearbox on an aircraft and vice versa. So if you've just measured gearboxes or just measured engines without understanding the outcomes, then you'll get the answer wrong and you'll get the program wrong. And it's really important that in our department, we have people who have served on the front line, who understand engineering and understand those issues. Otherwise, we'd have a load of clever accountants who just added things up. We don't need to know, we had 10, we spent 2, we've got 8 left. What did we spend the 8 on? How do we measure that 8? That's the important thing. 2 years on, how are we doing? You could argue not great. We haven't had as many qualifying defence contracts as we'd hoped for. As at yesterday, we're up to 56. Only 20% of the single source procurement activity undertaken by the Ministry of Defence is under the regime. Those of you mathematically sharp will identify that 80% is outside the regime. That's a problem because that's a significant amount of money that we don't have an eyeball on. And there's a lot of blinking. Does the MOD blink before the contractor blinks? And should we really be doing foreign military sales outside the regime? The MOD has identified and captured £53 million. You could argue, in the grand scheme of things, £53 million is petty cash. It wouldn't play a footballer here for a season, I wouldn't have thought. But £53 million has cost the government £5 million to create. That's a pretty good return on investment. And it's on 20% of the spend. If we had 100% of the spend, could it be even more efficient? We are an organisation a bit like in social care, you employ people to help people to live alone at home. There's an argument that if that contractor is successful, you will never pay them any money. Because if you think about it, people living alone at home shouldn't need anybody to help them. If our regime is effective, we shouldn't do anything. Because defence contractors will be honest and straightforward and get a fair return, and the Ministry of Defence would get value for money, and I could play crib every day. That's not likely to happen, I accept. But we're not a policeman who likes to clout people. We are a policeman who likes to help people comply with the regime. We are collecting data that has never been collected before. That information on gearboxes, that information on nuclear steam raising plants, that information on learning curves was never captured. And if I tell you a major defence contractor in the FTSE 100, when asked about learning curve in manufacturing, asked me what I meant by learning curve, made me nervous that they had their finger on the pulse. What is interesting is when you compare those defence contractors that work fundamentally in the competitive world and also do single source contracting, tend to be much more efficient than those that only work in a single source world because they don't have to be efficient, because they've got the contract anyway, haven't they? So what we've got to do is bring that commercial leverage into those single source businesses. I don't want to trundle on for long. It's an interesting, new area. There are many challenges. But fundamentally, just over 100 years ago, 37,000 soldiers went over the top at the Somme for the first day, and only 12,000 came back. And one of the reasons, if you look at history in defence, one of those reasons was it didn't have the kit to communicate that, in fact, the guns had not cut the wires. The generals knew the wires hadn't been cut, but they couldn't communicate to the front line. They went over the top anyway. That is due to lack of equipment at the right time in the right place. And that is what we're trying to do, because we don't want the Somme again. Happy to take any questions. None? Excellent. Oh, there's one at the back, sadly.
Yeah, you talked about the difficult part for you to assessing the risk was the percentage that should be down to program risk.
Yes.
And you gave a figure, was it plus 25, minus 25?
Yes.
Can you give any kind of comment on that analysis, how that's undertaken?
The bit I'm less worried about is the program risk, where we can identify, in fact, it's the MOD who identify where there's a risk outside the control of the contractor. And they then agree with the contractor whether it's a plus or minus 25% on the baseline profit rate. My concern is the risk that's in the project that I can't properly see, and I'm told that I'm an expert. You don't need to worry, Ian. I'm an expert in helicopter manufacture. I know what the risks are. Well, we can't work like that anymore, because that's not the way you work in a competitive environment, and we're trying to emulate that. What is interesting is the profits made by the defence community are very healthy in this country, if you look at the comparisons with other nations. And is that to do with risk or not? I don't know. But it's something we've got to start controlling.
Ian, a really good presentation.
Thank you.
You said you've identified £53 million worth of savings?
Yes.
How much of that has actually been saved? What's the actual material value?
All of that 53 million has been saved and is back in the pocket of the Ministry of Defence. One thing I didn't mention is, unlike in previous equipment plan programmes, every penny saved by the Ministry of Defence is reinvested back in the equipment programme. So it's not taken back by MOD Central, it's taken back into the Ministry of Defence and used in frontline command support. And all of that 53 million has been put in the old jam jar and used for future defence procurement. There is a lot more in train, but we don't like to talk about what's not been achieved.
Earlier, you said before the SSRO that deals were done under the table.
Yeah.
You're now looking and setting the profit rate, which is circa 10% of the total selling price. How do you know that deals have not been done within the remaining 90% of the costs?
How do I know?
That deals have not been done before they reach you. Obviously, contractors can move costs around within their estimates.
That's a very good question. What is interesting, at the end of the financial year, before the baseline profit rate is reset, there is a flurry of contracts, unsurprisingly. I don't know. It's a Rumsfeldian question, because I don't know what I don't know. You could argue how many contracts are being let at 4,999,000, which are outside the regime, to avoid the profit rate. How many contracts are split into smaller contracts to avoid the regime? We don't know. What we can say is the Ministry of Defence have to comply with the Act, and the Act requires that to be followed. I have increasing confidence that there is less leakage, which is what you're talking about, outside the regime.
Well, I would say that obviously the third arm of your allowable costs are that they are reasonable.
Yes.
That often involves a lot of subjective estimates.
Yeah. When we designed the regime, we had two options. One is the US DoD, Department of Defense financial acquisition regulations, which are enormous and are rules-based. When I speak to my colleagues in America, people get through the rules because they're rules-based. There's always a way around them. We decided to go principles-based. Attributable and appropriate is quite easy to identify. reasonable in the circumstance is very difficult and requires the ability to put some intelligence on the programme. But it is, my opinion of what's reasonable and yours may well be different. I accept that's an issue, but what we're trying to do is make the contracting authority think about that reasonableness rather than telling them what it is. What we don't want to say is what is reasonable. It's a difficult one to take.
Have you looked at other forms of contracting, particularly, let's say, in construction industry and in the railway sector that I'm more familiar with, that perhaps engenders more collaboration and has got rules around what are and aren't allowable costs and seem to work quite well?
Yes, we have. We've looked at all the industries that are either in heavy engineering. For example, the railway industry uses the same engine as a main battle tank, CV-12 6-alpha engine. So we've looked at heavy engineering, looked at bridge building, road building, all of those major manufacturing, construction and infrastructure programs. There are similarities. There are, and there is a danger of overlaying something that occurs in another industry. Collaboration is an interesting point. It's a bit like the word partnering, which worries me slightly. It has legal connotations. And indeed, the MOD is starting to contract in a sharper way, a bit like the railway industry and what they're trying to do for HS2, for long-term contracts, sharing risk, sharing reward, increasing productivity. The challenge is it's very difficult. An example, we looked at the US. The US built about 130 nuclear submarines. We're building 4 of the Dreadnought class and only 7 of the Astute class. The comparisons are really difficult. When you look at the railway industry, hundreds of trains, hundreds of miles of tracks. It takes 12 years to build one. We can only build 3 next to each other. The infrastructure to build them is enormous. So the industries are very difficult to compare. Striking though it is, but what we are trying to do is get the MOD to learn lessons from those industries about smart contracting, about collaboration, about all those bits and pieces. There is a big danger of saying, well, that works, we'll do it over there. Any other questions? One thing I'll leave you with is there's a question at the back. One interesting note while I speak is coming out. The new nuclear submarine for the UK Armed Forces, the Royal Navy, is the first submarine in the globe where a sailor has their own bunk. It's very interesting. It's only 5'10" long, and you have a locker that big, which lasts you for 3 months. The only reason they're only underwater for 3 months, a nuclear submarine can stay underwater for 25 years without surfacing. It makes its own water, makes its own oxygen, and powers itself. There's only one reason why it has to come up before 90 days are up. Food. Unfortunately, sailors eat. I think we should put robots in. Never understood the Navy, they don't work weekends.
You mentioned that one of the upshots of the work you're generating this large body of data.
Yes.
But you're also then saying that, and I recognise that these projects are incredibly complex, they undergo massive amounts of change.
Yes. And
I've worked in some large organisations, things like Network Rail. They're generating huge amounts of data. I'm sure there's. Question is analysing that data at the time, drawing conclusions, getting it written down, such that you can actually then use those conclusions subsequently. Otherwise, you end up with this huge volume of information that the actual the environment around that data is not understood. So, what work are you guys doing to analyse your data contemporaneously and draw your conclusions and document that, let's say annually, for example?
We've created our own analysis team who are people who are experts in the sector. We're creating a new programme called DEFCAS 2, which we're commissioning at the moment, goes live in April, which allows that quick, rapid turnaround of data. As importantly, we've looked at the supply chain and worked out what's important and most important to measure, back to my gearbox versus engine versus engine. What we're trying not to do is measure everything, because we don't need to measure everything. We need to measure what's important. And we spent a lot of time on measuring those things. We also have a thing called the defined pricing structure, which breaks an item down. If you take apart a nuclear submarine, Astute class £1.3 billion a shot, we take that into bits and build it up from the base to come to that 1 point, what has been spent where and what's important and what's relevant. It is a challenge, a bit like cost engineering and risk engineering, it's a challenge. Again, more of an art. What you don't want is loads of mathematicians who do all the adding up and don't know what the data means. So we're trying to get clever analysts in, and indeed we have done so, who are clever at manipulating that data and asking the so what question. So what if it costs 1.2 billion? If that's what it costs, that's what it costs. It's about value for money, not cheapest. And a big risk is we don't want to create that. One last question. We've got 1 minute before I get shot. This lady keeps holding up a thing.
How do you put a price on capability within the industry
Yes.
to be able to produce a main battle tank or an aircraft carrier or a nuclear submarine? There's clearly a case to be made for being able to do that in the UK as a standalone. But you've also sort of made a case also for buying an American nuclear submarine potentially, or anything else. So how does the MOD or whomever put a price on being able to buy a British submarine, a British aircraft carrier?
Okay, there is a piece of work being undertaken by the Secretary of State at the moment, and that's about the defence industry. And how do we manage the defence industry? Do we want a defence industry? Question. If we do, how big do we want it? We currently make no tanks in this country at all.
That's right.
Is that right or is that wrong? Now, that's not for me to say, but we're starting to ask that question at the top. What do we want the defence industry to look like in the future? For how long? And what capability and capacity do we need it to have? The danger is with defence, as you will probably know, once you lose that capacity and capability, it's gone. You cannot, it's too expensive to recreate. You're now stuck with buying abroad continually. Do we want to do that? It's an expensive game to play. And the Defence Industrial Strategy, which is being created at the moment, and we are contributing to that, as are others in the room, is looking at what, together with the defence industry, what do we want the defence capacity to look like in this country? Do we want to build our own nuclear steam raising plants? Do we want to build our own submarines? We just built 2 more aircraft carriers. Are we going to build any more? What do we do with that capacity and capability? Very good questions. Thankfully, not for me to answer, but I accept the point. And we've got to be careful we don't put our foot too hard on the neck of contractors, because we don't want people to leave the industry.
Thank you.
Thank you. That completes the voting in the Luxembourg jury, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.